All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Hello and welcome everybody. So welcome to this webinar. It's entitled Drawdown Aligned Investments in Finance. This is part 1, Greening 401ks. My name is Julian Kraus-Polk. I'm a senior associate at Drawdown Labs, Project Drawdown's private sector testing ground for accelerating the scaling of climate solutions quickly, safely, and equitably. This webinar is being hosted by Project Drawdown in collaboration with WorkForClimate, Climate Finance Action, and As You Sow. I want to remind you that this webinar is part 1 of a 2-part series on Drawdown aligned business investments in finance. The second of which is on decarbonizing corporate cash, and that's going to be held on Monday, July 18th at 11 a.m. Pacific time. So just to start things off, effectively tracking and reducing finance-related emissions is a new frontier for business climate action with massive potential to shift capital towards climate solutions. There's also rapidly growing attention on these financial levers as the business case and risk management logic becomes increasingly compelling. So for these 2 webinars, our intention is that they're informative, but also action-oriented. So our goal is that these sessions, that businesses leave and participants leave these sessions with inspiration and also clear action items. So yeah, we have a really packed agenda today. So first, we're gonna provide some context of this webinar within the context of the broader Drawdown Aligned Business Framework. And then we're gonna go through a quick overview of climate safe retirement funds, then have a panel discussion, and then move into an audience Q&A. So as we move through the kind of presentation and panel portion of things, please keep questions in mind, and feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer those at the end. And then finally, to kind of wrap things up, we'll kind of outline some very clear steps that companies can be taking, and ways to follow up. Yeah, and with that, I'll pass it over to Jamie Alexander, the director of Drawdown Labs.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. And thanks to all of you for being here and to our partners for co-hosting this with us and providing the critical information that you'll hear in this webinar. So I wanted to quickly ground today's session in sort of the broader landscape of corporate sustainability work. As we all know, and as Julian alluded to, corporate sustainability leadership is a moving target and an ever-evolving space. It seems like every day we're learning about new ways that business can influence the climate crisis for better or worse. And what leadership looked like in the past is no longer sufficient to the scale and urgency of the crisis that we face today. So we now know that leading businesses can and must go well beyond simple net zero emissions reductions goals into leveraging their full social, political, financial, and employee power to help secure a stable climate and just future for all. So with that in mind, we at Project Drawdown and Drawdown Labs, the team that I lead, created what we call the Drawdown Aligned Business Framework, which you see on your screen. This was our effort at really getting out on the table many more of the leverage points that companies have at their disposal. And this includes, but goes well beyond a focus on emissions reductions targets. So in this framework, you see that we've identified 8 leverage points. And it's our sort of working hypothesis that more will be uncovered as time goes on. But if we implement these more broadly across the business community, this could help create a tidal wave of systemic climate action at the speed and scale required to match the climate crisis. We acknowledge that this framework represents a pretty high bar, and a lot of this, including today's session, is new. So that's why over the coming year, we'll be doing deep dives on each of these leverage points to provide businesses with clear guidance and hands-on support to implement and help normalize these leverage points. So today we're going to be double clicking here in this climate finance box and doing a deeper dive on how business can help accelerate climate solutions finance by greening their employees' 401ks. So thanks again for being with us, and back to you, Julian.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie, for that introduction. So moving right along, I'm just going to quickly introduce the speakers today. So Andrew Behar is the CEO of As You Sow, and he's going to be providing some opening remarks to give an overview of what we need to do to provide climate safe retirement funds. And then we'll move on, and Josie Moore, the campaign manager for WorkForClimate, will be facilitating or moderating a panel with Mary Cerulli, the founder and director of Climate Finance Action, and Regina LaRocque, who is associate professor at Harvard Medical School and Mass General, a faculty member at Mass General Brigham, and they've been working on providing climate safe retirements for the folks at Mass General Brigham. And then I've already introduced myself and Jamie, who we're both on the kind of Drawdown Labs side of things. And with that, I will pass the virtual mic over to Andy with As You Sow for a little presentation overview.
Well, thank you, Julian, and thank you for inviting me and for having this, because 401k plans are a real source of impact. There's quite a lot of impact, and we'll get into some of the details on it. But the overall issue is just that right now, climate change is at a point where we are at really at the limits of what the planet can take, and so we need to do this rapidly. And that there's approximately $10 trillion in 401ks and 403b plans, these types of investment vehicles. And the thing about it is that the 100 million people who own them really don't have any idea what's inside of them. They don't realize how they're constructed and just how much power they have to actually make a difference. So we can go to the next slide and I can give you a little overview. So there's a couple of different ways that people have their money invested. These are a defined benefit plan. It's like a pension plan, and that, but we're going to be focused on these defined contribution plans. So this means that an employee contributes a portion of their wages. So it's out of every paycheck, a little piece of it, or 4%, 6%, whatever it is taken out. Oftentimes these are matched by the company, and so they grow rather rapidly. That's a 401k is for medium, small, basically businesses. 403bs are for education and non-for-profits, and the TSP, or the Thrift Savings Plan, is the federal government's plan, but essentially constructed the same way. And go to the next slide. So companies pay wages, and they select and approve these investment options. Now, these investment funds, they're held in stocks and bonds. So basically, they're mutual funds. Mutual funds are a basket of stocks. And again, a lot of people don't quite realize what that means. So Vanguard, BlackRock, Fidelity, those are the bigger companies who construct these portfolios. And pretty much across the board, they are invested heavily in fossil fuels, carbon reserves, coal burning utilities, as well as on other issues, social issues, private prisons, weapons, that sort of thing. High deforestation risk and a high emission sectors. So when you opt into this plan, you are opting into owning and profiting from Exxon, Chevron, big coal-fired utilities like Duke and Southern, pipeline companies, deforestation companies, and most people don't realize it. It's also hidden from view. And one of the things that, As You Sow, we've been working on since 2015, when we first developed fossil-free funds, is just shining a bright light on it. People should know what they own so that they can align their investing with their values. So these climate unsafe investments create a lot of risk. There's business risk. So first of all, they put Paris goals out of reach, and there's a lot of financial risk to the portfolio as well. And we'll show you some examples of some sustainable options versus ones that are more full of fossil fuels. So this has a direct risk to climate unsafe investing, and it spills over to the entire portfolio. So basically, this risk just keeps on growing, and most people are just simply unaware. And the system is designed to keep you unaware. So we'll get into that later too. Next slide, please. So climate safe investing, also called sustainable or socially responsible investing, also ESG investing, which stands for ESG, stands for environmental, social, and governance. So these ideas have been going on for well over 30 years. And there's a lot of companies who actually develop really good ESG mutual funds. And indeed, they are much less risky. There's other ones that have come to the more recently, particularly the larger ones, Vanguard and BlackRock, they simply took a fund, they renamed it ESG, but they didn't change any of the holdings. And this is one of the problems. We did a study in January that we shared with the SEC that showed that there were, in 3,000 funds that we look at, 90 of them had ESG in their names and 60 got a D or an F on ESG. And that's just because of the fund naming rule. Now the SEC has come out with new rules about that, but let's not go down that rabbit hole right now. But so it's starting to be addressed. So the idea is it's reducing exposure to investments that are not Paris aligned. It also will reduce your stranded asset risk. Now, stranded assets means that companies they keep on investing billions of dollars every year in looking for more reserves, even though what they already have on their balance sheet, they will never be able to take out of the ground. If they did, we would be at 6 degrees. So they've got to keep these reserves in the ground, which means it can never be commercialized. So it's a stranded asset, which is going to harm the company and harm your portfolio. In terms of lower returns, not according to the evidence. It's basically the risk of investing sustainably there is not a financial risk, that they are good ones and there are bad ones. And it's just a matter of how they're constructed. Next slide, please. So basically, this is just some statistics around what do people really want in their retirement funds? Do they want to be invested in oil and gas? And voters of all parties, they simply don't want their retirement account put into this risky types of investments. And you can see the numbers here. They're really pretty overwhelming that people want to be invested sustainably, and they want to be part of a sustainable future. That if you think about it, it's your pension fund. You're going to be retiring. And when you discover, and we have seen this a lot, people discover that they're invested in their own destruction. They're invested in a future that's not going to be on a livable planet. That is a very emotional response, and that people want to move their money, but oftentimes they can't because they're not given any options within their plans. And that's what we're going to get into right now. Next slide, please. So employees basically need access to climate safe investing options. Now you have a right, if you're in the plan, to talk to your plan administrator and to get investments that are aligned with your values. But people need to be educated about this. We have found through our surveys at companies that people don't even understand how the portfolios are constructed, or that these companies even exist within them. So there needs to be a lot of education around there. But we believe that a climate safe plan, that the default investment option, which typically accounts for more than 50% of the plans, should be sustainable. And a default option means that what happens is when you start your first day at work and they go, do you want to be in the 401k? You say yes. They just default you into this, generally what's called a target date fund. Now, a target date fund has a date on it. So if you were 20 years old when you did this, or let's say you're 30 years old and you're going to be retiring at 70, just add 40 years. So right now it would be a 52 fund. And you could, or let's say you pick a 2050 fund. It's got more equities in it now. And as you get older, it will become more bonds or more conservative. And that's how it works. So you pick every one of these funds, and we'll show you those in a minute. So employees that assume the default option is safe, but generally it is the one that's the most just chock full of fossil fuels. And that's, in some cases, in some companies, that's the only option really. Next slide, please. University of California has actually done a really good job. They've removed all companies that own fossil fuel reserves from the UC retirement program. So there are ways to do this. This is just one that we hold up as a good example of how you can actually do it and reduce risk in the portfolio. Next slide, please. So just some terminology here. So greenwashing is the fund truly climate safe, or is it just marketing? And I mentioned there's a couple of like Vanguard and BlackRock funds, the BlackRock Low Carbon Transition Fund, which in the first day of existence, got $1.25 billion. That's a record. That one is full of, it's got Exxon, it's got Chevron, it's got Duke, it's got Halliburton, it's got deforestation. That's what you call greenwashing. The reason they got that much money is because they're called Low Carbon Transition Fund. I think it should be named the Business as Usual Fund, and it would not have gotten that. Woke capitalism is a new term that's basically kind of misguided, ideologically driven backlash against environmental, social, and governance. Environmental, social, and governance is not political. It is simply describing ways of removing risk from a company. Environmental risk, so having a climate transition plan. Social risk, having racial justice and DEI. So ESG is just about risk. It's about having a good business and having good management. But the alt-right has been attacking it because a lot of the funds are moving into ESG because it's less risky. So it's a defensive mechanism, and a lot of states are adopting now legislation forcing their pension funds to not invest in what they call anti-oil companies. The QDIA is just that short for the Qualified Default Investment Alternative. That is the default option that we talked about. And the DOL ERISA rules. These are the rules that the Department of Labor lays out to say what is an acceptable DC plan. And a lot of people misinterpret these rules to think that they can't invest in ESG. They feel like that would breach fiduciary duty. It's not true. What the ERISA rules are really about is that you need to consider financial returns. So, and every administration comes in, they mess with the DOL rules to get them. They're very confusing and they're internally contradictory. So, but the bottom line is, so long as you consider financial and other risk aspects, you're in a good place. Next slide. So if you go to the As You Sow site called investorvalues.org, you're going to come to a page that looks like this. These are the first 401k plans that we have posted, and they're going to be posting another, I think another 6 or 10 in the next month or so. So if you came here and you clicked on, say, Amazon, you would go to the next slide, which would show you what is in the Amazon 401k plan. Now, the Amazon 401k plan is a Vanguard target date fund. So you can see that it's getting a poor score in fossil fuels, in deforestation, in prison industrial complex, weapons, and tobacco, and a fair score in gender and civilian firearms. So a poor score means you're getting a D or an F on our rating system. And we did it like this with stop signs because we tested this with Amazon employees and they got confused with A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's. I know we were surprised too, but we decided let's keep it really simple. They just didn't quite understand. They thought it was an acronym. Next slide, please. So this is if you clicked on your fossil fuel rating, it gives you some details that your fund owns Exxon, Chevron, Duke, and it's a whole bunch of information about exactly what's invested in fossil fuel companies. And you could do a deeper dive with that green button. You could go in and see all the detail on exactly what's inside. Next slide, please. This shows you a summary of the entire plan. So Amazon has $676 million invested in fossil fuels and 52 in deforestation. So you've got, you've got quite a bit of capital put into sectors that you might not want to be invested in and are very risky. I'm going to keep reiterating that. So this, and then again, this is updated once a month. So we get the holdings of every mutual fund once a month. We update it, and it's displayed automatically. Next slide, please. So 1/28 of the plan options report a sustainable mandate. So one out of the 28 options. So there's 28 different things you could choose. So basically under 2% are invested in a sustainable option. Now it exists, it's there. And when we asked Amazon employees, they did not know it was there. But you can see that most of the money is going into the default option. I believe it was 52%. Next slide, please. Now this, actually, well, just one more note about that sustainable fund. That particular sustainable fund outperforms the default by 5 percentage points over 10 years, 5 percentage points over 3 years, and 5 percentage points over 5 years. So not only are people not investing in something that's more aligned with their values, but they are also not making as much in returns, like a significant amount, 5%. The next slide. So now we're doing a little deeper dive on the 2050 retirement fund. And as I mentioned, 2050 means you're planning to retire in 2050. And so you're going to be having more equities now, more stocks now, and you'll be moving into more bonds as you get older. So you can see that it gets a D grade. It has Berkshire Hathaway, Exxon, BP, Conoco, Phillips. Next slide. Oh, can you just go back one? When you go to the site, you'll see the tabs on the top. It says fossil fuels and then carbon footprint. We actually aggregate up all of the carbon emissions by each of the company in the funds and divide by the dollar amount. So we give you a tons of carbon per million US. So you could compare a $2 billion fund to a $200 billion fund, apples to apples. The other tab is Clean 200. We rate and rank companies that make the most revenue from the clean energy future or clean energy present every year, and how many of those companies are in the fund, as well as other tabs. You can go to the next slide. Just looking at the fossil fuel holdings, you can see that we break it down into the Carbon Underground 200. Those are the 100 largest oil, gas, and 100 largest coal companies by reserves. And you can click on any of those to get to get details. But total, you have 762 companies. 8.13% of the portfolio is in fossil fuels. And each one of those sectors, you can see exactly how much money and how many holdings. Next slide. I guess that's the end of my story, but there's a lot of detail. When you go to investorvalues.org, you can do a deep dive into each one of those, how it's broken down, each company, and also you can click over, there's a scorecard, you can click over and see the deforestation piece of it, which is also very closely linked. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that great overview. So now we're going to quickly transition to have a panel discussion. And so I'm going to hand the mic over to Josie Moore to help moderate this panel. And I'm going to spotlight Mary Cerulli and Regina LaRocque, as well as Andy, to have this discussion. And then again, we'll be having a Q&A afterwards. So feel free to put questions in the chat.
Thank you, Julian. And while he is getting the other panelists spotlighted so that you can see them too, just to give you a framework for this panel discussion, the presentation we just saw, that really provided the what and the why of the need for climate safe retirement funds. And this panel discussion is going to give you the how. It's how can an employee get support and resources in order to help advocate for climate safe retirement funds as the default option within their company. And so let's just dive right in. I want everyone to please meet Regina. Am I pronouncing this correctly? LaRocque? Okay, so Regina, let's just dive in. I'm excited to hear your story. So why is greening 401ks important to you, and what led you to decide to work on pushing for climate safe retirement funds at Mass General Brigham?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And actually, this was an incredible presentation that I wish I had had the opportunity to see a few years ago. Maybe I'll just relate my story a little bit because I think it is exactly what's being discussed here. I'm a doctor. I work at a hospital. And, a few years back, I discovered that our plan administrators were going to be making a decision on all of our behalves about where our 403B money went. And it was all going into a target date retirement fund. And that was a decision that was made for us, and understandably by our institution, I think, to reduce some fees associated. But I decided to ask a few questions about where that money was going exactly. And mostly because I was concerned about how these investments aligned with my goals personally and with our institution's stated mission. And it actually was incredibly difficult, as Andrew alluded to find out where, how this fund had been selected, where the money of the fund was invested. I spent time downloading Excel spreadsheets to learn where the fund was investing our target date assets. And I learned that it was going into things like fossil fuels and tobacco and things that were clearly not aligned with my own values or the mission of our institution. And so that's when I embarked on this process of learning and advocating. And I think for me, it involved partnering with some other doctors in my own institution to raise this issue up to our pension committee. It took a lot of work to bring the issue forward. I think, as Andrew alluded to, ERISA is a big concern that comes up, and we heard some pushback about that. And then along the way, I was fortunate to partner with Mary Cerulli, who has taught me a lot about what has just been discussed on this webinar. But what's happened in our institution is that the issue has been brought forward, I will say. It has led to the addition of an ESG fund, which is new. It actually just became available to us in January of this year. We subsequently learned the ESG fund, as Andrew alluded to, wasn't quite what we had hoped for. And so really the next big step is thinking about how we can have QDIA, target date retirement funds, that are aligned with climate safe investments. And that is really where the conversation is happening now within our institution. But we've been able to bring this issue forward, and by partnering with knowledgeable people in the area of finance, I think we've shown that employees educating themselves and working together and bringing the concern to the right people in their institution, we can make change in this area. And so I've been fortunate to have Mary Cerulli as a partner in the activities we've done here. And I actually really, it took me years to learn what Andrew just presented in the last 10 or 15 minutes. So I think this is a very valuable starting place for anybody who's thinking about this within their own institution.
Thank you so much, Regina. That is an amazing story of just you really taking initiative and diving in and finding resources. Luckily, everyone here who's attending the webinar shouldn't need to spend the amount of time that you invested in. But that now more resources are available to people like you doing the same kind of work in their own organization. People like Mary Cerulli over at Climate Finance Action. And I'm also really interested in hearing your story, Mary. So if I'm remembering correctly, you spent 20 years in the financial services industry. So what moved you to start Climate Finance Action, and how have you and CFA worked effectively with Regina and other doctors at Mass General Brigham to advocate for climate safe retirement funds?
Thanks, Regina. You just kind of said it all, and you know, being a leader at MGB you're just such a pleasure to work with, and to educate the folks around you has been really very meaningful work for CFA and myself. CFA was really started because we saw this gap, as you've heard, well, as you can imagine, effectively pressuring these big, huge asset managers is really challenging. And so we've identified two different strategies that we feel like have super impact. And one key avenue to pressuring asset managers or asset owners, or we really think of them largely as the public owners, like public state pension plans and city plans. And so the state treasurers and comptrollers that are very influential to those plans. But then on the private sector side, the side that we are talking about today in the defined contribution segment, we feel like there's really very low education among stakeholders, as has been discussed. And there's, with this disproportionate power of the asset managers and even customers that are part of organizations that really hold sustainability and, I guess, doing the right thing and aligning with Paris, that hasn't been brought over to kind of the money or the retirement plan side. And so we find that educating folks as yourselves and others, and then hand-holding as much as needed to create some credibility and to be able to speak with the CFO of your company. Like Regina got a meeting with a couple of her other doctor compatriots and had a really successful meeting with the CFO. So when you get to that point, we want to be there with all the information you need and to make things happen. Check.
Thank you so much, Mary. And so back to you, Andy. You've heard this story and you've heard how Mary worked directly with these employees to advocate to their asset managers for Brigham General, to Mass Brigham General to advocate for their asset managers. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that story. And can you share any other powerful stories and studies in progress or any other companies or institutions who are working on this?
Sure. So why don't I start with our own? I mean, the reason that we built fossil-free funds is because we were involved. As You Sow, by the way, is a 501c3, and we do shareholder advocacy work. So we were working on this work around building the climate divestment movement. And part of it was this pledge I pledge that I will divest. And personally, I helped write the pledge, so I signed it. And I realized I didn't have a clue what was in my own 401k. And so I started looking and looking. It took me weeks. I was downloading spreadsheets and couldn't figure this thing out. And Andrew Montes, who's here in the room, he came into my office and he was like, "What you doing?" And I'm like, "I can't figure this out." And he went home and that weekend wrote a little code and scraped the As You Sow 401k plan and brought it back. And I discovered at that point that I was invested in a company, in a fund that was 100% fracking companies. And we had been filing resolutions with fracking companies for years. We were like the leaders in this fighting fracking. And it was just so appalling. We got everybody together in the conference room and just said, "Look, we got to tell the truth. This is what we didn't have any idea. We were all invested in Exxon, Chevron." So we called our financial advisor and said, "We're not happy." And he said, "There's nothing you can do." So we said, "You're fired," and brought in a new person. And within 3 months, we had designed a whole new plan for ourselves based on what we're a small organization, so we could all fit in the conference room and talk about it. So that's one example, but that's why that was the birth of fossil-free funds. So we said, let's share this tool with other people. And then Andrew just started building it. And it is what it is today because of his incredible work. And so another example, we started working with a company, maybe a 200-person architectural firm. So what's interesting here is we recommend that they do a survey of their employees, find out what they care about, which was climate and gender at the time. And so they just added some fossil-free and some gender equality funds. And by doing so, the employees felt heard. It changed the culture of the company just in that very act. And then they started to get much more investment. By the end of the year, they went from a 40% participation rate to 80%. They doubled. And the average participation was 3%. People were taking out of their paycheck, went to 6%. So they quadrupled the amount of savings from the company. And I remember asking the owner, I said, "Doesn't that increase your match?" And they were like, "Yes, every nickel is well spent because it builds a culture. It attracts the best and the brightest. This is like the best money we could spend is matching people's retirement plan." So there's a lot of fringe benefits to doing this when a company decides to. And one last note, not a positive story, is with Amazon. We put out the Amazon 401k scorecard. We sent a letter to Amazon. We also did the same with Comcast. And what happened is, so we said, let's set up a meeting. Let's engage. And at first, both companies, the people in the meeting were like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I work at Amazon and my own company's burning down the Amazon. I'm horrified." When they came back for the second meeting, they had attorneys with them and they said, "We can either confirm or deny, we're doing nothing." So we escalated by filing a shareholder resolution. Those They still wouldn't do anything. That went to a vote. We got a decent vote. We will continue with both those companies, and we've now filed resolutions at Microsoft and Campbell's, and we'll continue to educate employees. That's really the purpose of the resolution, is to try to find that voice where the employees can be heard by management.
That is an incredible story and just amazing. And I'm glad that Andrew Montes is here too, just to give him a shout out for all that he did to build that. But I mean, this really makes me wonder, and this perhaps is a question both for you, Andy, as well as Mary. So why have so few companies added climate safe funds? And do you see that changing right now?
Go ahead, Mary. You can.
That is a good question. And I think with the Department of Labor's renewed stance on ESG investing, it creates a more accommodating, I guess, fiduciary environment for ESG investments. But also, the data shows that there's a lot of resistance because of litigation issues that surround much more than just ESG, but also because the QDIAs, mainly, the BlackRocks and Vanguards, the big index providers, haven't heard the demand. So they may be slow, but if they hear the demand from their clients, and if that DOL rule goes through to crystallize the proposal, I'm more optimistic that those big index providers and the target date funds will start to listen to their clients. What do you think, Andrew?
They just are unmoved. I mean, we have tried so many things, I got to say, over the past, we started this in 2015, and just building fossil-free funds and deforestation-free funds. And the big asset managers and the QDIAs, the default options at these big companies, they are just so resistant. It was actually surprising to us when we met with Amazon. What our expectation was, and maybe I'm naive, was, oh my gosh, thank you, because we did a little survey of their employees. Thank you. This is so easy. We can get this fixed, and we can this will improve our relationship with our customers, and we can also link our climate activities. Like, they're getting 100,000 electric vehicles, so it's like they're so out of compliance with their own sustainability goals. But we can silence that cognitive dissonance, is what we thought they would say. Thank you, and put it into work. And instead, they were just like, we're doing nothing. Literally at the end of the meeting, and I've been to a lot of corporate dialogues, but at the end, when we said, can we talk about next steps? And they said, why? Was the first time ever. And this was, we're in a lot of contentious things. This we thought was not going to be as contentious, but there's something about it. And there's a lot of mythology too around that we're going to all go to jail for breach of fiduciary duty. This has never happened. There has not ever been a lawsuit for a 401k administrator that added that shifted to a more sustainable option being sued. It just never occurred. And yet you ask anybody and they're saying, no, it's like there's too much risk. So it's, again, a lot of mythology, and but you got to remember, there's $10 trillion here that they just don't want anybody else to, have access to. So, they've renamed their funds. There's some BlackRock now called sustainable target date funds. They're not. There are some target date funds that are more sustainable. There's a company called Natixis. There's some other ones that's the only one that has a 3-year track record, that actually outperform as well. Just, as a side note.
Thank you so much. I just want to pivot kind of on that note, thinking about, what kind of resistance that employees might face as they work within their own organization, as Regina did. I'm curious, Regina, so some people might be nervous, people watching, people either right here in the webinar or watching the recording, they might be nervous to push for these climate safe retirement products within their companies. They might fear that they're jeopardizing their job, or they might have anxiety about standing out. How did you transform any internal obstacles that you faced, if you did face any, into an approach that emphasizes your leadership in supporting your organization to meet its climate goals and fulfill its values?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think the status quo is hard to change. I work in the healthcare sector, and honestly, I think we're a special place because we have missions that are stated and that include things like advancing the health of our communities. And so in many ways, focusing on the healthcare sector for some of these efforts makes a lot of sense, because it's quite apparent that there's a conflict between the organization's mission and some of the activities of that are being supported by the investments. So it becomes quite easy to point to the discrepancy. I think for my part, it was really a matter of just pointing to that and saying that we need to align our stated mission and values with what you're doing with our retirement funds. And I think that fell on very receptive ears. And it may not be the same in other sectors, but in the healthcare sector, that did fall on receptive ears. Personally, I find that it's important to always partner with somebody in the organization, have a partner in whatever you do. And so I had a few other, doctor partners in these conversations, which took place over a long time. And you also have to establish yourself as a credible, knowledgeable person. And I think that is what is sometimes challenging for people who are not financial analysts. I think being armed with the type of information that Andrew has presented here is very important. And sometimes you need to bring other people into the room with you. So it's been very helpful along the way for me to be able to invite Mary in, to have somebody who speaks the language when you're having conversations with people about investment plans. So, I think having a partner, establishing credibility, talking to the right people, and being persistent are all, and we're not done with the work we've started here, but I think that along the way it's fallen on receptive ears when we've couched it as important to us and aligned with our personal and institutional values.
Could I just add, on the Investor Values website, you'll find there's an action toolkit, and it's broken down into 3 sections. One is for individuals, one is for plan administrators, and one is for investors. And on the individuals, we actually give you template emails to send to your peers, just to say, hey, we're on the water cooler. Did you realize we're invested in big oil? And most people are like, we are? What? Just to get that conversation going, we have templates to send to your administrator. They're very respectful, saying, you're part of the plan too, and we want things that align with our values and values of our organization. It's really sitting on the same side of the table. And so anyway, there's a lot of different tools that we have, and we take you through a 5-step process to actually develop a community that can have that conversation, to bring it forward to your plan administrator in a very rational way, that this is something that they could provide. And generally what I think you'll see is they're going to say, okay, we can add a fossil fuel or a fossil-free fund, or a deforestation-free fund, or something with more gender equality in it. And what we really want is the default options. That's where all the money goes, or most of it goes. Starting out with getting at least some options is a good thing. Some plans, what they do, like the TSP, the Thrift Savings Plan, they had a lot of folks who were saying, why is this? Because it's real. TSP is one of the most egregious. And so what they did is they added what's called a brokerage window. It means you can go outside the plan and you could buy any other fund. So a Green Century fund, a Parnassus fund, a Calvert fund, but they're very difficult to use. And I've yet to find someone who actually successfully completed it, actually use that option, but it does give them at least pushback to say, hey, you can go outside the fund and you could go invest in anything you want, regardless of, we have to keep things with really low fees. That's another response you're going to get, is you've got to have, just like, 5 basis points, or that's the most fees we can pay. So just realize that's an option, but we don't see a lot of people using it. So,
the other thing that I think was very important in our conversations was the discussion about risk, and the fact that honestly, continued investment in potentially stranded assets is really a risk that our plan administrators are subjecting us to. Mm-hmm. And I think that being very clear that this is not about, a pie in the sky ethics or values. This is also about, we want return on our investments, and we want sound investment strategies applied. And that includes moving away from risky, climate unsafe investments. And so that has been a very important part of the case. And Mary has been very articulate in that topic as well. And I think that what Andrew has just said is absolutely correct, that these are the things you hear. And I do think that we need to be moving towards default plans being climate safe and risk appropriate. And so I think there's many avenues in which this is the right way for our money to be invested.
Thank you so much. We are
the three actions that we're asking companies to think about are: 1, providing employees with at least one commensurate climate safe retirement option. So that can't be a super high fee option. It has to be like a competitive option. 2, educate employees, and this was talked about a fair amount, annually on the relative climate risk and exposure of retirement options. And then 3, eventually, ideally sooner rather than later, shift to a default climate safe target date fund. And we talked about target date funds a lot today. And that could be working with an existing asset manager like Vanguard, Fidelity, or BlackRock, one of the big ones that a lot of the companies here probably work with. Or it could be a new, asset manager that you potentially shift to. And then lastly, we really hope that you all will just follow up with us. So we're all here, honestly, on deck to help you transition. And that's the kind of work that we're excited to do. So if you're looking for kind of more hands-on support for climate safe retirement funds, you can contact Mary Cerulli. If you're looking to kind of get more information on your 401k and specific exposure to fossil fuels, contact Andrew Montes. And then if you're interested in kind of like, if you're an employee interested in advocating for climate safe retirement funds, contact Josie Moore at WorkForClimate. And then just leaving you here with this last kind of resource for plan administrators to really think through, if you want some written guidance on how you can do this within your own 401k plan. And that's it for today. And I know we're 2 minutes over, but really appreciate everybody staying on, and thanks so much for coming. And just a quick reminder that we're going to have a sort of part 2 of this Investments in Finance series next Monday. And it's going to be a slightly different topic, talking about decarbonizing corporate cash. And so, that's Monday, July 18th, and hope that you or some colleagues can show up for that webinar. And thanks again to all the panelists. Really appreciate your time and expertise on this issue. All right, stay in touch.